So welcome everyone. I am just giving it a few minutes for everyone to join us as we before we get started, and then we'll start with some introductions of our panelists. This is it's a fun group, and it was I was excited to get this group together, especially this time of year when there's so many competing priorities. But it's also a time where many of you are making software decisions, and what a great time to share some of these insights. And I'll give it about a minute for sort of everyone to jump in, and then we'll start with the introductions. This I will repeat one more time, sort of as we continue with the presentation. But for all the attendees, if you have any questions that you'd like me to address with our panelists today, feel free to throw them in the chat. I will see if I can intertwine them with our discussion. And part of the reason why I say put them in as we'll try to do them as we can. There's a lot to cover today, and with our four panelists, there's a lot of experience around the table. We want to make sure we make the most out of it. So we don't want to leave questions for the end, because I worry that then we're not going to have time for questions if we leave them for the very end. But if you put them through, and then I'll see how I can do some as we go, and then leave some for the end. So I will start with some of the introductions with our panel, and I gave them a heads up that we will do this alphabetically by first name, which means we're going to start with Chad, go with Dara, Irene, and then Rob, and then I'll introduce myself last. So Chad, can we start with you? A brief introduction of yourself, please.
Yeah, thanks, Gary, and thanks everyone for joining. So my name's Chad Aboud. I started my career in big law, doing M&A and corporate finance for public companies, moved in-house the second half, in-house at Indigo, and then GC of a portfolio of technology companies. And at that portfolio called Audience View, I implemented automated contracting. And so, had a wonderful experience with the benefits of tech and AI for legal teams. And now I have my own advisory and coaching firm where I help lawyers and other participants in the industry think about how to get more out of their career, get more out of their teams, and have deeper connections with their clients. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. My name is Dara Nevin. I'm a managing director in the Digital Insights and Risk Management Group at FTI Technologies. I had a decade in tech before going to law school. I practiced for about 13, 14 years in Canada as a litigator doing e-discovery, and moved down to the United States. I've been in both law firms and in-house departments. In addition to delivering on data law issues, which often involve the transfer and transformation of large data sets, I've helped both law firms and law departments decide on technology to use and implement it to deliver better value.
Thank you, Dara.
Hi, everyone. I'm Irene Zaguskin. I'm a partner and chief information and technology officer at PwC Canada. My background is really the intersection of three practices of technology, business operations, and cybersecurity. And I specialize in taking organizations through large-scale digital transformations. The reason I'm really excited to be here today is our organization has actually taken a big step forward with AI. We rolled out Gen AI to all of our staff in Canada, so about 9,000 people locally and about 170,000 people globally. So some great stories to share today.
Thank you, Irene. Go ahead, Rob.
Hi, my name is Rob Morris. I've been at BLG for 10 years. I sort of wear three hats at BLG. I'm the COO, which is where I was hired to do originally. Then I moved into the CIO role, so I've been doing that for a while. Then more recently, I've now holding a sort of chief exec role for our BLG Beyond ALSP. In terms of background, I come from a very technology background, used to be a design consultant, then got into legal, then started to work for big law, whether Clifford Chance or Baker McKenzie, and now sort of BLG for 10 years. I'm very happy to be here today. Technology and driving digital transformation is core to my DNA. And so I'm looking forward to a good discussion on that particular subject.
Thank you, Rob. And I'll throw fun facts about our panelists today throughout the panel. Rob was also in the British Navy at one point, so you can ask him about that offline. But as a quick introduction for myself, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Gary Kalatsi, CEO at Alexa Translations. I started my career as a lawyer and had been doing translation for a while and pivoted to translation. We acquired an AI machine translation technology company in 2018, and that was sort of our entry point into the technology space and a lot of the learnings that came with it. For many of the first few years, I used to say, I'm not a technology guy, I'm not a technology guy. And then eventually I said, I feel like I should stop saying that I'm not a technology guy. I shouldn't necessarily go say I am a technology guy. Just stop saying I'm not a technology guy. I think the learning curve has been immense, and there's been certainly a lot to learn throughout this process. And that was part of the rationale for putting this webinar together. For those of you that were here at the very beginning, you probably heard me say that this is the time many of you are procuring software, budget cycles, etc. Whether you're looking at it for 2025, whether it is that some of your budget cycles have already started because they're not necessarily calendar, we thought what an important time to think about it. And the way we're going to structure the webinar today is that we want to go through the journey that you as a buyer or as somebody within an enterprise is looking at and saying, what are the solutions I need? So at the very basic level, we're going to start about identifying the need, and is software part of the most basic level? Should we even look at software as part of the solution? And then think through, how do you evaluate the software? Like, what are the ones that fulfill the right needs for the organization? Then think through about security considerations and what that looks like, what it would take for that implementation stage to be done effectively. Then go into a bit about, okay, that's all in there and it's implemented. How do we actually make sure that the implementation is effective to actually get these needs addressed? Talk a bit about how you sort of go back and see the data points around the success for this. And then what happens when things go wrong, if we have the time. So Dara got very excited about that. She's like, I deal with that all the time. But this is, we have to think of sort of every scenario. So a lot to talk about. I encourage any one of you to throw in questions and in the chat, and I will see if I can intertwine them as we go. But that's the reason why I want to give that structure in advance, is that way you know sort of what's coming, and then you can think of your questions accordingly. I would like to start with the first question with Irene and Rob, and then open it up to Dara and Chad afterwards. But really, the first question is, as business identifies needs and they talk about a particular need internally, Irene, how do you go about saying, hey, is this something that we should look at as a technology, and then sort of how do you start defining, to the extent it's technology, what that technology should look like?
Yeah, I think it's a great way to start the conversation. It's a conversation I have every day at work, and especially right now with the rise of Gen AI. I think when we talk to our businesses, everywhere they go, all they hear about is Gen AI. I don't think there has been one conference, one business conference, where they haven't spoken about Gen AI. And so it generates a lot of excitement, a lot of hype. And people come back thinking, what can I do with Gen AI? How can I be cool? How can I apply Gen AI to what I'm doing? Which is a good way of thinking. However, that's not how Gen AI projects start. You should always start with, what is the actual problem you're trying to solve? So if you think about it, Gen AI is a technology. It's a technology like any other. Technologies have been around for a long time. Technologies are also not a silver bullet that are going to make all of your problems go away. It's a tool in your tool belt. Now, Gen AI is an amazing tool in your tool belt, a very powerful one. But the question should always start with, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What are the outcomes you want to achieve? What is the value that this is going to bring to our business? Is that something that we want to prioritize? And then once we understand the business problem, the value, and the desired outcomes, then we evaluate what are the right ways to address that problem. And it might not be Gen AI. It might be a process change. It might be a people change. It might be a set of technologies that are brought in. But that's part of the evaluation phase. So once you've defined the problem, then you look at what would be the right solution, and then what are the right tools to enable that solutioning. But let's not start with the solution and then come up with a problem for that solution.
And Irene, very good point. Rob, I will even give an additional example, because you've probably had lawyers come many times being like, I was at this conference, I saw this amazing tool, we should buy it. And you have to reel them back in and say, let's think through of the bigger picture. So how have you seen this play out internally, and how have you addressed it?
Well, similar to Irene, I think we've been driving a digital first culture in the firm for a while. And so, which is great, and you're pushing out the culture to sort of really embrace digital, AI, all the things around technology. And so that's great, but then you get inundated with requests, like you say. People go to a conference, they see a new product, they think it's going to deliver some fantastic solution, but they haven't quite thought through what it really means in terms of transformation. So I think some of the things we're doing very similar to Irene in PwC. I think we're looking at an improved intake process, and also making sure we're very honest with the vendors who are coming with these tools. I think one of the issues we've had in the past is by the time the product's already been seen by the business, they're already excited to get it on the desktop and start rolling it out. And we haven't even contemplated the security issues and the data residency and all those different issues. So I think one of the things we're really trying to get ahead of is, if there are products out there and people are excited about them, let's make sure that before it even comes to an intake process, the vendor understands the rules of engagement, if you will, of coming to a law firm like ourselves. I think that's the big one we've been developing, and I can expand more if we have time. The other big one, of course, is I think the role of the business owner. So, to Irene's point, we've got people coming in saying, I need this new tool, it's going to solve a really important business problem. And often the resolution of the business problem is left to others to go and resolve. And I think those days have sort of changed now. It's now really that business owner who, yes, they might find a piece of technology or whatever that can actually change, but the bigger piece of work is the actual transformation itself. So who's going to own it? Who's going to work with the vendor? Who's going to work with the internal support teams? And then more importantly, who's actually going to work with the business and all the various stakeholders to really transform? Because I think everything I'm seeing so far with the AI, you only really get the value when you actually transform and change the way in which you deliver the service, be it to a client or internally. And that to me is the I guess the success story. If you can get that right, then you're off to the races.
Yeah, Rob, thank you. Really appreciate that. I do want to come back to you later around how sort of technology providers and technology partners should think through about approaching organizations and add value in a structured way that adds value to you later, because we do have people in the audience that are from the technology space. Dara, I know you've seen this both from a law firm perspective, and now you consult a broad spectrum of clients. So what have you seen as sort of strategies that work well around the assessment stage of saying, let's figure out if technology is part of the solution, and if so, let's define what that is.
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Rob and Irene have said. A lot of what I try and do is actually slow down the entire process, which I know sounds counterintuitive. But it's exactly as Rob and Irene say, there are also some complexities in addition to the security elements. And that's, how does this piece of technology integrate into the existing stack? And what's it going to do to the technology infrastructure? And that's often something that the end users don't see. So one of the challenges, particularly in a law firm where, from the outside, it looks like everybody's doing the same thing. But when you're in law, you realize that a transactional practice is very different than a regulatory practice, is very different than a litigation practice. You can end up with a multiplicity of point solutions that can get very difficult for the technologist to administer, and it can become very costly for the organization. So like Rob and Irene, I like to walk the business owners through, what is this going to look like? Where's the data going to come from? What's the health going to look like? Are we going to create artificial silos of information that are going to become more difficult to work with? And the way that I like to help people through it is to imagine a day in the life when it's in their desktop and to actually do the mapping. So I'm a big fan of doing process mapping with a gap analysis as part of the technology transformation, so that the business owners have a really good understanding of what day 60 looks like or what day 90 looks like, and not just their imagined day 1. That also really helps with the planning, with the integration, the time to implementation, because if you're working with the vendor will start to understand the difficulties in integration. Maybe there's an API they need to develop. Maybe we need to platform it in someplace different. So it's actually an S3 bucket that we need. And we can think of all of those things before going to the deployment. Involving the business owners also helps them understand the complexity and create often partnerships with other places in the business. You can get sort of a 2-for-1, 2 different places in the business using it at once, because you understand more of flow of the technology and how it's going to deliver value to the organization, and not just contextually, like this is how it's going to work in my practice, but this is how it's going to work in the firm or in the department. And then all of the risk discussions just have better context for the end users. So those are some strategies that I've found very effective.
No, and Dara, that makes a lot of sense. It really complements well what Irene and Rob mentioned. And Chad, I know that you've sort of had to wear the role of the hat of GC before, amongst the various roles from private practice and even consulting. What were some of the strategies you employed when you said, hey, before we implement a solution internally, let's think through what that need looks like?
Yeah, I mean, these are all very real and, complex topics that my panelists have all raised. And this is what happens when you contemplate a technology implementation. And so if you're a legal team, and I was a GC of a lean legal team, so then your first question is how? How am I possibly going to get from using Microsoft Word or the G Suite to all of that, especially when I've got 1, 2, maybe 3 people on my team and I got a fast moving business? My best advice is it's not about the legal team. Make it about the business team. So if you think about the type of tech that you're implementing, there's going to be a use case for your business. Even if you feel like that technology benefits your legal team only exists to benefit the business team. And so tell the story of how the business team wins. Don't make it about the legal team. So an example would be for sales. Sales is trying to close deals around the world 24/7, 365. Well, if you create technology or if you implement technology that supports them by doing that, you're speaking directly to what they care about, which is closing deals, closing quota. Use that talk track. And the reason why I say that is because the sooner you can get the business to understand how the technology is going to vastly improve their existence, those are the folks that have the resources that can support you to get through all of these very complicated topics that my panelists have raised. And so you need them to say, here's a resource, here's financial resources, here's human capital from our team. When I implemented technology, and Alexa Translations was one of them, the folks that were helping me implement were from the business teams. It wasn't just my team that was doing the implementation, but you only get there if you're talking about the business first. So I would really think about what is the main case that you can solve that gets the biggest win for the business teams. Pull that thread, and you can layer the legal considerations underneath. That's not for them as much to be thinking about on the forefront, so that you get buy-in.
Excellent point, Chad. The broader the application internally, the easier it is to get buy-in sort of cross-organizationally. I will move on to the second portion of this discussion, and really around, you've now defined, okay, we need, we thought about what the need is. There is a technology approach that can be done. Now, and Dara, what I'll do for this one, I'll look to you first and then sort of ask Irene, Rob, for any further thoughts, and then Chad to jump in only if because I think that we're going to run out of time with all the insights we're going to have today. But really, the idea is we now have defined that we can actually have a technology that can resolve this. What do we look for in that? What are the criteria for that solution that we look for? And then, as part of the criteria, what are the criteria from a functionality perspective? And you already touched a bit on this, Dara, so how we can integrate, et cetera, internally. And what does that technology partner commit to doing? Like, will they help implement, et cetera? Do they customize it to you? Then, what are the confidentiality and privacy considerations of that tool to say, while this may fulfill the criteria from a functionality perspective, can it fulfill the confidentiality piece as well? And first, I wanted to do those as two separate questions, but I know that it's better if we do them in one shot because we need to make the timing count.
Yeah, it overlaps. So I think particularly Irene and Rob have spent a lot of time already discussing like just determining the business case. So let's say you've gone through all of those business negotiations and you've decided that a purchase is the right place. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is like how you now map those business requirements into resolving risks through the contracting, right? Just doing that due diligence piece to get comfort in what you're going to do. And I'm going to leave the cybersecurity parts to Irene because I know she's got a lot to say about that. So what I will talk about are a couple of things that people often don't think about when they are buying an AI solution, which is a little bit different than other technology. So one is to really understand how that AI is functioning, what it's been trained on, and what it's been tested on, and if there's any risk to those data sets. So what I mean by that, because I've seen this, where a data set that has been used to train an AI then becomes off limits to the company and they have to revise its training and testing set, and then the product doesn't perform. So let's take a step back. Any AI achieves its outcome because an algorithm, which is a little bit like a recipe, has been trained on data to understand a particular problem, whether that's extracting clauses or translating or doing predictions on how a court will proceed. So it's been trained on a certain set of data, and then there's a testing set of data, which is similar but different to make sure that the results are consistent throughout time. Really do due diligence on where that training and testing data came from and that the company has the right to use it and that it's stable and is a good source that will outlive your use of the technology. If the AI vendor loses access to the training or testing data and there's not a good substitute for it, there's a risk that the tool won't perform over the long run, similar to how it's performed when you've done your analysis and decided to buy the tool. And that's also true to make sure that it's got the right privacy protections in place, that it's got the right confidentiality protections, that it's not using any data that it should. Some clauses that you're going to want to look at are the IP rights, indemnification if they lose access to the data, and termination clauses around that. So that's a little bit different than buying hardware or other software. And so those are some really important considerations. Then if you're going to be feeding your own data into it, if you're going to be feeding your own client data or your own proprietary data, understand what's going to happen. Is it going to be mixed with other data? Are they going to use it to further test and determine what's appropriate for you and your organization? And then also determine if you need to change any of your disclosures out to your clients, for example, in engagement letters or anything else as that data flows through. So I often like to map that data flow through the technology and through the organization's use of it to be able to help understand where the risks might be.
Yeah, that's very insightful, Dara. I think there are a lot of pitfalls in that journey, and it was great to get an overview of them. I think from my perspective, I'll take a little bit of a step back and provide a bit of a broader view. So the way we look at how do you get a successful implementation, how do you set up yourselves for success, I really see 6 core components there. You might have a great idea, you might have a great business case, let's say as it pertains to AI, but step 1 in that 6-step process is you really need to make sure that you have leadership buy-in. And that means all the way from the top down through your organization. If you're going to be taking your firm through a large transformation or a particular group, make sure that you have full leadership support. Those projects work much easier and much better if your firm's aligned on the strategy, you're aligned on how you're going to proceed, and you have support throughout the ranks. The second piece, and a few of my peers have touched on this, I know Chad talked about it quite a bit, is having the right team. Having the right team means those implementations, and I'm a CITO, but I'll be the first person to tell you, it's not a technology implementation. It's a business transformation change. And so you need to make sure that you have your legal friends at the table. You need to make sure that you have your risk friends at the table. You need to make sure that you have your line of service friends at the table. It's really a cross-functional team that will make it a success. Or the minute you have to sign a contract, you're going to be stuck. The minute you're looking at risk posture and whether that's aligned, you'll be stuck. So you need to have the right team. You also need to have the right process and the right decision-making process, because sometimes you need to be quite agile with your decision-making. New announcements come in, new regulation changes come in. They can and likely will impact your project. So be prepared for that. Dara also talked about data strategy. Data strategy is key to having these projects successful. For one, you need to make sure that your data is available, because your data might not be available, or it might not be clean, or it might not be ready, or you might not be allowed to use it. So having a clear definition of scope and whether you have the right data is going to be key. And then as you're selecting technologies, you're selecting vendors, you need to understand how that will fit into your internal technology landscape. There might be a really great technology out there, but it might not work well with what you have in your organization already. So be very conscious of your technology architecture, of the decisions that you're making. How will all of that come together into a coherent system that will be supportable, safe, and secure? And then I would say last and not least is looking at risk, governance, and responsible AI. How are you making these decisions? Do you have your policies? Do you have your internal risk tolerance defined? How is the solution that you're proposing fitting into these frameworks? Are you staying compliant? Are you thinking through the implications of the work that you're doing, what it might have to your organization reputationally, internally, etc.? So really stay focused on both risk, governance, and the responsible AI framework as you're looking at new initiatives.
Yeah, Irene, definitely a lot to unpack there, and it's I think an important point that be prepared to pivot, because sometimes regulations or business needs may evolve, and see what that looks like. Certainly, hopefully we can chat a bit more about strategies around how to do that as we continue as well, because some of the audience may be like, that's great, how do we prepare for a bit about it? But the Rob, I want to come to you on this front as well. I know that sort of having done this at multiple law firms, and even on the consulting side before that, you've seen this in a variety of perspectives. How do we look? What is the best way to optimize this part of the process?
Well, I think to Irene's point, this is not just rolling out simple technology anymore. This is complex, and I think all the stakeholders, be it the business owners and the support people, need to realize that this requires a lot of change. Whether it's change in how you actually do your services and you deliver them, or is it change in the support model that supports all of this. I would say a few of my takeaways was, first of all, make sure you've got some money. Yeah. So, from a budget perspective, I think it's really important that anyone who's embarking on one of these, make sure you've got sufficient money, set aside. And it's not just to buy the tool from the vendor, it's to support the people who are going to roll this out, and even to support the business so they have time to dedicate to this kind of thing. As Irene mentioned, the leadership and the structure is important. You need to have it on the top all the way down to the bottom, that everyone's buying in and they understand the implications, both on what the product can do. And then we all want to get excited, but we know in law firms change is challenging, especially when we're all very, very busy, trying to keep the lights on. I would also say foundation. Think about putting in foundational parts. I think you heard earlier that whole data management. I think that's been quite neglected in law firms, I would say, when I speak to my colleagues around the world. And now everyone's doubling down on sort of ensuring their data management, data privacy, risk management, data classification, all of those things that we heard earlier are really becoming front and center in order to support the business if they want to go down that sort of AI stream. The other thing is, I always say, is what does the future look like? So after you've done the project, everyone gets excited about the project itself, and everyone goes, well, we're going to deliver something brand new and it's exciting. But then who's going to support the thing afterwards? Yeah. And then what do you do with the legacy? Yeah. One of the big things I have is we're really good at adding, we're not so good at taking away. So what do you do with the legacy infrastructure, and start decommissioning some of that legacy stuff to allow, capacity to be freed up, etc. And then finally, on that risk management thing, I think the problem I have with risk management is more of, we can write every single data privacy policy around AI and the responsive use of AI. My question is, driving compliance, and is it manageable? Can you actually drive compliance, and can you do it in a manageable way? So if a client says you cannot use AI on any of my service lines, how doable is that in the world of AI when all our vendors, including our existing ERP vendors, are all introducing AI capability into their toolkit, So those will be my sort of few takeaways.
And Rob, a lot of important takeaways there. To your point, AI is becoming a bit more omnipresent, but I think Dara touched on this as well. Is AI can get different forms. It's distinguishing what that looks like can be such a critical part of it, and sort of informing ourselves in the process is critical.
And I think there's been my history in law firms has been, we typically just figure it out, and we just do it. And with the existing team and everybody just seems to find a way of getting it done. I think, like I said, this is way more complex, requires a lot more transformation and due diligence and all the things we've discussed. So we have to be very mindful that we can't just, roll it out like we used to. We have to sort of think more strategically and tactically to get the thing delivered.
And I want, as a general next piece, I really want us to talk about, once we've procured the tool, what that implementation looks like so that we get the results we want out of it. But Chad, I want to give you an opportunity to speak to this, but I also want to ask you an additional smaller question. That as we do this, what can the technology partners do to make your life easier as you're going through this contemplation? And then open it up to anyone else on like any quick tips that you have on to anybody in the audience that is from a technology side to say, here's what you could do to make our life easier as we go through this contemplation from functionality to security, etc.
Yeah, I'll just tackle that one because I think my three panelists did an amazing job on the first question. So when you're selling to what you think is going to be your primary stakeholder, so if you're a technology vendor selling to legal teams, you feel like it's the GC or maybe there's a legal ops person. But the big unlock, I think, is what is the story that the general counsel or the legal ops person has to sell onward into their own team or into the business teams? Because the legal team may not have the budget all on their own, or they may not have the ability and influence to make the buying decision all on their own. And so as an example, if you're thinking about, you're talking to a general counsel and you're doing kind of a discovery with them and saying like, okay, what are your major pain points, not just with your legal team, but how you interact with the main business teams that might use this or integrate with this software. And you're thinking, oh, okay, well, also you're integrating with an account management team and you have thousands of clients. Well, that account management team, boy, they must really be working hard to like slice and dice the data to create new reports on this client segment all the time. That must be tricky for them. Great news is you're going to be able to allow them to do that with this technology that we're offering you. And this is the way it does it for them. And so what you're doing is you're giving them a pathway that knocks down the barriers that are in front of them, because they're going to need the business teams in order to want to integrate, to champion the software, put their resources behind it. And so if you do some of that work for the general counsel or the person that's running the legal ops function, then you're giving them an entire toolkit that they would otherwise have to create themselves, and they may not even know how to. So I think that's a huge value add if you're a technology vendor.
No, really appreciate it, Chad, and certainly for Irene, Dara, Rob, if there's anything else that you think the technology providers can do to make your life easier, please jump in, and otherwise I'll move on to the next question for us.
Just happy to jump in maybe with a little bit of a framework in terms of how to think through some of these investments. Sometimes, you have 200 ideas coming your way. How do you prioritize? How do you decide what's important? And then how do you translate it into value to the organization? So something that I leverage as a tool to help on that journey is we have a bit of a framework that we leverage. First question we ask. Every ask that comes in, is this to generate revenue or is this to take out costs or improve productivity? So any use case has to land in one of these two categories. If it's to generate revenue, let's be very clear on who generates revenue for, how. Is that an offering to your client? Is that a new service that you offer? So it really helps narrow down your thinking in terms of what's the end value that this is going to bring, who is this going to bring value to, and what kind of investment will be required behind it. If it's a cost out or productivity play, well, how does that work in our organization? Is it going to transform our internal operations? Is it going to transform how we actually provide our offerings to our clients? So again, it helps narrow your thinking into what is the group that is going to benefit? Is it a cost out play? Is it an increased market share play? So top line versus bottom line. And then it helps you dive into what is the actual business impact of the investment versus us sometimes getting bogged down into the functional requirements and who are the people that need to do the work, or in other words, focusing on how the sausage is made versus what is the actual output.
Really important point. Go ahead, Dara.
Yeah, I was also going to say something else. there's the sort of sales place where you're trying to work with people like Chad and Irene to identify the business case. And so everything that they've said is fair. What I would also recommend is just then understand the likely technology context for when you get passed off to the next line, right? And then you don't need to sell them on the solution anymore. But what you really need to understand is what's the likely technology and business context in which that technology is about to be implemented. So I'll give you a great example. If you are selling into a law firm, the likely place that lawyers keep information is not in the Microsoft Office suite, but in a document management system, likely something like iManage. So the integration mechanisms are going to be very different in that context than if you are selling in to a corporation. And so just be ready to answer those questions. Same thing, when you start talking about integrating into finance, that's going to look very different in a law firm than it is in an organization, because law firms have a certain types of finance suite, whereas enterprises have a very different type of finance suite that is very differently integrated for legal context. So I think do a little bit of research about the organizations you're proposing to sell into and what their likely technology stack is, and that can avoid a lot of delays in implementation if you've already created those APIs and have strategies around that implementation. Yeah, you're all smiling because you've all been there, right?
We all have.
I mean, Gary, if I could add to the
Please.
discussion, I would say to the vendors on this call, you know, one of the things I've noticed with vendors is they're brilliant at working with the technology folks in the organization. They speak the same language, they get around a table, they talk about integration, and to Irene's point, functional requirements and user acceptance testing and technical acceptance testing and how we're going to integrate the data and the architecture and everything goes on. But often the conversation doesn't sort of say what's in it for the business. You know, what's the user experience going to be like? You know, who's going to own this from the business? And equally, often the vendors don't have that person who really understands. We've talked about this earlier, but really understand. Yes, I'm going to solve a problem maybe in finance, you know, because we're putting a new billing system in. But then you've got to then look at that and what does that mean to the end user who experiences the billing relationship with their client? And so I would say to the vendors, you really need to pivot a little bit more on really understanding how to speak plain English, you know, to the business stakeholders, to really say to them, hey, if we roll this new technology, we get that we can integrate it, we can do all the things IT wants us to do, but this is how we're going to help solve your business problem and make it a better user experience, be it for your client or be it for you know, lawyers in the law firm. So that would be my big take, because often I work with vendors and they're very heavy on IT and technology, but when you say, well, how are you going to roll this out and how do I do the change management and how do you deal with lawyers and train them and get the adoption, often you kind of hear crickets a little bit on those discussions.
Well, and Rob, some really good points there. In fact, it makes me want to add a couple of things that I've learned along the way, just being on both sides of the equation. But I'm going to pose the next question first before I do that, so that I give you a chance to think about it while I add a couple of the comments. And really, what I want to ask you is, let's say we've gone through this entire process of assessing the need, assessing what software is the right software, the security, etc. We now have it. It's day one, as we talked about it, and hopefully we had thought in advance to think what day 30, 60, 90, etc. looks like. But what do we look out of that implementation? What do successful implementations look like? Because and we talked about this even as we were preparing for this. So a substantial percentage of software, over 70%, failure being defined as either they don't get traction, don't get renewed, sort of don't fulfill what they were required to do, or don't get sufficient gravitas internally. It's a small percentage that uses it because of failures in implementation. So despite all that due diligence up until that stage, if you don't see through, and several of you alluded that this is a change management exercise as much as it's software implementation. So how do we do effective software implementation? And this is the question. I will start with Chad, go Irene, Rob, and Dara. But before that, as you think about it, I wanted to add a couple of things that sometimes when I speak to software companies and they pick my brain on this, saying, oh, you've done it for some time, sort of what does that look like, or what do you recommend? I always say, look, and Dara talked about integrations and what are the integrations the client cares about. You need to make sure that you do those in advance. Before, if it's a likely need for the client, you don't want to wait to do those, because integrations especially with third parties, can take so much time that the more you can do ahead of time and say, we're already integrated into your various portions of your ecosystem, a lot easier for the end user to say, okay, I've checked off a few boxes. You start getting this sense of the security questionnaires and what are the requirements. So certainly, like, work towards SOC 2 Type 2 certification if you don't have it. If there's certain questions you see popping up in the security questions all the time, prepare responses that you can repurpose all the time. I just find that so helpful. And more importantly, especially in the world of AI, you need to customize things to your client, because if you don't customize it to a large extent with their data and their environment, et cetera, they're just not going to get the same need as your out of your box solution. While it's easier to sell an out of the box solution because you could just pump it out without as much customization, just the client is not going to get the same level of use. So typically, as the moderator, I don't go into this much detail. I just thought it worth sharing a couple of those, and hopefully it resonates with you as well. So Chad, to my original question around effective implementation.
I'm glad that you added it, Gary, because when I was a GC buying Alexa translations, you did all of the things that I was talking about, and I think a lot of us have been talking about, is you're helping us think about what business buy-in looks like, business use cases, successful integration. So, you're foremost expert, my friend, on this. So I'm glad that you added that. When I think back about implementing this technology in a lean legal team in a fast-moving, vertically integrated SaaS company, is I think two things were really, really important. Let's assume you believe me that the storytelling for the main business outcome, for the main use case matters. So let's assume that you did that and you've got the business folks agreed that it matters. Here's two things that I did. One is immediately created the opportunity for the 4 or 5 main stakeholders that would integrate or be users of the outcomes of this technology to form a team. Now, I didn't force them into it, but I explained the value prop of them having a representative in that team from day one, and they were in it from demo to selection to implementation. And this matters because you don't want to keep chasing everyone to tell them updates about how V1 of your implementation is going, and then they say that's not at all what I wanted. You want to make sure they always had a chance to be at the table to give feedback. So that was critical because we were getting real-time value adds, but also you're managing the expectations because they are going through the journey with you. And I think that if you can manage those expectations, real-time participation to get their value inputs, you're going to end up with a result that people know is coming and they get the value. The second thing I'll add is, if you don't think that the technology vendor you're buying from is the right one-stop shop for you in terms of implementation, integration, support, you can take out certain pieces and find separate integration support consultants. And that's what I did. I found somebody who I knew was certified in our CRM, certified in our CLM, and had done that implementation before that was separate from the vendor, because I felt like I was going to get a different slice and style of value add in the weeds, pushing the pipes together. So, when I think about successful implementation, is two things: making sure we had a cross-functional working team of a representation of all the power users, and two, making sure that you have the right external support, and it doesn't always have to come from one singular vendor if you feel like you can break those pieces down.
Yeah, Chad, that actually really resonated with me. Completely agree with you that having the right team is a key to successful implementation. It's very often that I see people, for some reason, treat technology as a silver bullet, right? Like, we're going to light this technology up. We're going to give everybody access to it. It's going to make all of our problems go away. The next day is going to be great. And I've seen with my own eyes an example of where a company embarked on an implementation of a Gen AI solution. It was a simple implementation. They rolled it out organization-wide to thousands of people. And on day one, everybody was really excited. Everybody logged in, looked what it was all about. It looks fine. It works. Great. Day 3, 50% of the people logged in. By week 2, it was single digits, and that number did not come up. And so if you think about it from a tech perspective, it was a very successful implementation. Nothing broke. From a business value perspective, it was a disaster. because there was a huge investment made and they weren't getting the ROI. So where the gap was, and I think, Chad, you have spoken to some of it, as have Rob and Dara, is the challenge was they didn't take their people on the journey. The challenge was you didn't have the business stakeholders involved day one, being active participants and contributors into what that journey was going to be. And so tech for the sake of tech doesn't solve our problem. What we need to do is really understand what is the business impact we want, get the people who are going to be impacted by it involved day one, and then create very structured, thought out change management journeys and client journeys for that rollout. Because specifically when it comes to Gen AI, it's not a technology transformation for the most part. It's a transformation of the workforce. It's a transformation of how we think about our role and what we do. It's transforming our processes, and it's transforming how we think and we approach situations. Like, personally, I'm in Gen AI every single day, yet I had to do a presentation a couple of weeks ago. I got a topic, great topic. I opened my laptop, I stared at the screen for 10 minutes, and I had one of these moments where I couldn't come up with anything. And then 10 minutes later, I said, why am I even doing this? So I opened my Gen AI solution, and then I started generating thoughts jointly with Gen AI. Within 10 minutes, we had the structure ready, we had the materials ready. Then I plugged in some of my own IP into it that obviously Gen AI wouldn't have. But the skeleton, the structure, that was ready in 10 minutes. Yet the 10 minutes before, I just spent staring at the screen. So I think it's something all of us can learn. And it's not just tech skills, it's just learning how to even think in a different way.
And Irene, it's an important piece because sometimes we don't think of everything we've experienced in one shot. They don't all pop up all at the same time. So just, if you have something that can prompt you to think about even things that you know but are just not coming top of mind right away, it's an excellent way to do it.
Gary, I'd probably add, it's funny when you mentioned, Irene, the journey, and I would say a lot of people, would say the journey ends at go live. Yeah. And to your point, a lot of the hype, a lot of the investment, a lot of the time and effort is put into the project getting to that go live. And then once you go live, everyone sort of disappears and they leave the operations to sort of run with stuff, and the business just to figure it out for themselves and drive adoption. So I can't agree more with what Irene said about this journey. Is it only begins at go live. That's where the vendors out there think about how do you do implementation post go live. And what does that look like? What is, the first 3 months? We know that often on a go live, there's going to be issues, there's going to be teething issues, there's going to be bedding down, and set expectations. Say it's not going to be perfect after the first go live. And set expectations that this is a journey, that after 3 months, it should look like this. After 6 months, we want to be looking like this. And after 12 months, we really want it delivering this kind of value, and make that very clear to the business. I know we're mindful of time. I would just say my few takeaways for people thinking about that post go live implementation. The first one would be vendor management. Yeah, at the moment, often the vendors go through a hard procurement process, the security reviews. It's very intense, but then vendor management doesn't really happen post go live. The vendors disappear. There's no account management. There's no proper vendor management. They're not integrated as a strategic partner, working with the business, in terms of continuous improvement, sharing knowledge, and often you can't make the improvements internally. The improvements have to come from the vendor. So I would say vendor management is so key now. And if you haven't got a proper vendor management structure in place, put it in, because then you can really drive continuous improvement in a real way. Similar to Irene, I would say have some KPIs, business KPIs, not, it integrates and it's secure and all those things. You need those, but the business KPIs, what does adoption look like? What change are we expecting over a certain period? Success stories, you can't not deliver enough success stories, whether it's internal or whether the vendors bring success stories from their other implementations. Often I find the vendors don't bring to bear the knowledge that they have with other law firms, and that is gold in terms of a change management tool. If a number of leading law firms are doing something in a particular way and have had success, bring it alive in a real way, because that can be a real change tool. And then I would say your change champions, they're not just the partners and the lawyers. Some of our best change champions we have in BLG are our paraprofessionals and our legal assistants. they sit with the lawyers, they work with the lawyers, they integrate the technologies into the, the legal service delivery. And so often that group are often a little bit neglected. So what we've been doing now is really training them up, not just on how to use the tool, but what's in it for the business, what's in it for the client, and be able to sort of sell it in a real way. So I would say use the paraprofessionals and the legal assistants who sit close with the lawyers in terms of being real change agents for implementation.
Thank you, Rob. Excellent points. Dara, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just, because I couldn't agree more with what Chad said about stakeholder engagement throughout the journey, and everything that Irene and Rob have said, I'll just particularize this. So often when you have a business outcome, maybe I'll take a step back. So in my experience, I found that technology implementations fail for one of two reasons generally. Either the technology doesn't do what the users think it's supposed to do, or it's just too hard to use, right? Because they either haven't received the correct training or because it's actually more difficult than what they're currently doing. And a lot of the time when we think about technology, there's a difference between what we think the technology is going to implement and who is actually going to be doing the work to do it. So the partners, for example, might want a particular outcome. They might be part of Chad's strategic engagement committee, but it's actually the mid-level associates and some of the paraprofessionals that are going to use that technology. So often we have to have 3 or 4 different storyboards, and that implements that affects how I engage with vendors. So as Rob said, vendor management is so important. So often training is press this button, but I try and push them to come up with narratives that align with this is how you're going to do this particular piece of work. Right? So associate, when you log on, this is the screen it looks like. This is where you need to go. And I either create little sizzle reels or materials that don't just show them the features and functionality, but that show them the features and the functionality of how they're going to do a job that is painful for them or that they don't like. I'll often interview associates or people to say, okay, what's frustrating about your current workflow, and solve that problem first to get adoption so that people want to adopt the tool because it takes a pain element away from them. And often I'll develop multiple storyboards, so 12 storyboards for a set of paraprofessionals, and introduce a new one every 2 weeks, and then let them get practice and design a way to measure whether or not people are actually implementing it. And if I can, and I've done this a couple of times, as people know, I'll often withhold the most valuable thing from people until they achieve learning in 3 or 4 different areas, and then expand rights as a reward so that those people are incentivized to become thought leaders and to implement it in their daily life. And what I often like to do, to Rob's point, is I can tell people to use something, but actually the most important champion is the paraprofessional talking to other champions, or the partner who said, listen, this technology made a difference in the outcome of the disposition of my matter. And then having them showcase that to their colleagues is the most powerful adoption technique possible. So highlighting those stories internally and externally is helpful. And often when you can showcase that even to external clients, whether it's other parties in the business or third-party clients, that can also really, really drive adoption as well. When people see the results and they feel like, it's a sort of hidden superpower for them, that's the most effective thing, because then you've delivered stuff in a way that people can understand. Here's how my job will change, and here's the result that's made a difference for me in my career, either because I can do more or look better or make things easier for myself or make more money.
There, really appreciate that. A lot of really good points there too. I'm glad this is being recorded. I may go back to it myself, despite our prep call and everything else. So, listen, I knew with this group there was no way I was going to get through all the questions we had prepared for this, and I actually didn't even have to use a generative tool. Like, there was so many of these just from dealing with this day in, day out that had popped up. But Dara, for this one, I'll actually come to you and then go you, Chad, and Irene, Rob, but just sort of 1 minute each. And really, what I'm looking for is how do we determine that a tool was successful? And the reason why I say that is we can't possibly estimate that it'll be 100% usage internally, or that everyone will use it all the time, et cetera. But like, what are realistic expectations around it? And perhaps will those change with time? Because sometimes what we expect year 1, 2, etc., maybe a little different than long term. Because that is, I think, we need to also give the audience the context of like, this isn't about 100% adoption. It's about some wins that are realistic.
Realistic. Yeah, I never try and get 100% win. I mean, that's like an exercise in frustration. I don't have any science behind this. I have just found that if I can move the needle to about a third of the participants using it on a more or less regular basis, we will achieve a tipping point of turnover in the organization. So I never aim for 100%, but often I've established those KPIs inside the business case. So either you can eliminate something right away, or you can identify what the total cost of ownership value is that you can achieve it with a 30% or 40% adoption, for example. So that's often very helpful. So the metrics that Irene was talking about, like after the third day, nobody opened it anymore. That's clearly, an evidence of a great destroyer of value. But if what you have is people constantly going to use it in the correct context, in the business context that it was solved, and also if the technology has extensibility, so you can continue to roll out features and functionalities, or users can use it to discover their own use cases, then in my view, that's successful. If about a year later, people can't imagine doing the job without that technology, then it's successful.
Thank you, Dara. Chad, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the KPIs that Dara talked about for sure. So a different one that I also used is like, what path are you building around the relationship management to understand whether your business users, if you're a legal team, or if you're a law firm, the lawyers that are using the tool, are they celebrating it in conversation organically? That's what I look for, because sometimes it can take a while to get like all the way up to the KPI metric you want around usability. But if when you're having conversations and regular check-ins about the value of the tool, if those power users are organically saying the value that they see in the tool and how it's going to impact their life, I believe that that is a great canary in the coal mine about like the medium and long-term chance of success for a tool. So make sure that you build time in for regular check-ins to continue the story and the talk track that you originally chose and celebrated when you bought the tool in the first place, to make sure that narrative stays sticky.
Yeah, I think fully agree with both Dara and Chad's perspective. Dara, what you've spoken about in terms of having the metrics, really knowing what was in that business plan. Did we hit those numbers? Did we hit those outcomes? Have we aligned with where we needed to be in terms of what was promised? That's definitely step one. Chad, I think your perspective of hearing the chatter, you will know from your people if you were successful or not. They'll be vocal about it. They'll tell you if you did a good job. The piece I want to add to it, and this really depends on what the objective was. Sometimes the objective is not just a technical one, but also a culture change for the organization. And so I'll give you an example. So for us, we rolled out Gen AI very early to the entire firm. The reason we did that is because we wanted to fundamentally change the culture of our organization, and we wanted to be best in market in those kinds of implementations. So what seemed really not authentic to us is going to our clients, trying to tell them how they need to do their Gen AI implementation if we haven't done it ourselves first. So we wanted to have a genuine, authentic conversation within our communities. And to do that, we needed to transform us, our people, and our thinking. And the reality is taking the firm through it really changed the way every single person in the firm thinks about technology. It's very hard to put a dollar amount on a culture change. It's also very hard to put a dollar amount on your authenticity. But right now, when we go to market, when we speak to our clients, when we speak to our peers, we can have a genuine conversation about, here's some of the bruises and the black eye I got along the way, and here's what I've learned, and here's what we have learned to do and what not to do, and here's some successes that we had, and here are some failures and what we have learned from them. So definitely an element on metrics, an element about the chatter and what you hear, but also let's not forget the cultural element and the organization transformation element that is a bit harder to put a number on.
Thank you, Irene. Rob, any last thoughts on this? We're in the last minute, so I know you're going to be
I'll be super quick. I on the tangible stuff, I think we've already covered it. Is it going to make revenue? Is it going to save money? Is it going to improve productivity? I think those are the tangibles, but they're hard, as Irie mentioned earlier, they're hard to measure. They're hard to say, when does it actually come in? Because there's a lot of investment and time and effort, so when do you get the ROI? So I think ROI can be a little bit, can send you down a bit of a rabbit hole a little bit. I think sometimes, what I've been doing now is, is it part of an overarching vision and strategy for the firm? So if I say, BLG wants to be the most digitally, technically savvy law firm in Canada, then the AI strategy will underpin that, in a real way. And so I think there's some intangibles where you can go through and say, what are the other things that we want to do in terms of what we want to measure, in terms of, whether it's success, or it's part of our strategic plan, or it's going to move the culture in a different way, or improve our client experience in a different way. So I think those are the other things I would just add to my colleagues.
Thank you, Rob. Some really important insights from this group, and certainly for anyone from the technology side, you are helping clients implement all the time, share those learnings, come up with the plans, make it easier for the buyers to really show how you can add value, especially at the implementation stage, and show that success. Thank you all for your time today. It was excellent. I'm glad it's recorded. I know many people weren't able to attend live, so this will continue on well beyond today. Appreciate all your time.
Thanks, Gary.
Great to see all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.